Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally back in North America. It is finally time to kick off the LTA North with split number 1, and with the first round of this bracket stage. It's a very different format, at least in winter, than we've come to expect in North America with the LCS for many years. No longer do we have the league-style round robin, qualifies for playoffs type of thing, at least not here in winter. We'll definitely get into some of the later formats later on in the year, but this is just a straight up qualifying bracket to get into the playoffs against the LTA South, of course, the Brazilian league, to see who gets to go to first stand, the big international tournament at the start of this year. And so the stakes are already kind of on. We're in best of threes, which I think is obviously a huge positive, and it's win or go to lower bracket here today already in week number 1. So a lot to fight for from all of these teams. If you want to know my thoughts on what I'm expecting from all of these teams coming out of the preseason, check out the primer and power rankings video that I did before all of the games ended up starting here. And so if you want to know my thoughts on what I was expecting going into the year, that's definitely a great place to start. But today we are going to be covering all of the first round series, all of these best of threes that qualify these teams for the next round. Now, obviously, nobody's guaranteed qualifying for playoffs off of just one series. You have to win 2 series in order to qualify, but this is definitely a great first step in seeing which teams are going to live up to the hype and which teams are maybe going to disappoint. But if you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you think of this week? Who overperformed? Who underperformed? Who were you surprised by in a good way and surprised by in a bad way? Always curious to hear you guys' thoughts down in the comment section below. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover. And at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be updating my personal power rankings if necessary at the end of this video. I say if necessary because obviously there is the chance that everything just goes according to plan. Spoiler alert, that kind of happened this week in the LTA North. That happened a lot last year in the LCS. This hasn't exactly been the most dynamic region in terms of upsets over the past couple of years, but there definitely still is a lot of interesting things to talk about. And so, without further ado, let's get into our first series, kicking off 2025 here and kicking off the LTA North, the first ever series under the new banner. It was a matchup between FlyQuest and Shopify Rebellion, a best of 3, of course, and FlyQuest predictably is going to be able to take it, but I think more encouragingly, they were able to dominate this series. It wasn't really particularly close in any way. Shopify was a team that I actually was relatively excited for coming out of the offseason. I thought that there was a small chance that they could break into top 4. I had them 5th in my power rankings going into this, but let's be honest with ourselves, they were never expected to come out and win this. They were never really even expected to be all that relevant in this matchup. FlyQuest really was the heavy favorites, not only for this matchup, but I think generally they're considered the North American favorites going into 2025, and I think that is rightfully so. This team is incredibly stacked across the board, and obviously they showed a lot of growth over the course of last year. They ended off really strong at Worlds, doing a really good job to qualify for, the quarterfinals and almost beat Gen.G in a best of 5. Like, there's just so much momentum and so much hype coming off of FlyQuest that them coming out here and dominating this series, it's not particularly surprising, but it is entirely encouraging. For Shopify on the other side, it's really not the way you wanted to start off this year. I think best case scenario here is maybe not a win in this series, because that would truly be like a huge upset if FlyQuest ended up losing their first best of 3, but I think best case scenario for Shopify was probably a little bit more competitive than whatever this was. It felt like they were outclassed basically everywhere. I get that they don't have their full roster here yet with Seos not having his visa ready and having to co-stream this game instead of actually playing in it, but there were a lot more problems than the bot lane in this game. Zeyzal wasn't particularly great, but the top side of the map was an absolute disaster, which we will get to. Player of the series, though, pretty easy for me. It's gonna go to Quad in the mid lane. This was a very Quad-esque performance. He got to play a signature champion in Cassiopeia in game number 1. They basically played the exact same comp they played at Worlds with the Urgot, Ivern, Cassio, like full setup. I don't know why teams are allowing them to have this. It feels pretty obvious that this should be the first thing off the board. It's clearly the thing that they are the most comfortable on, and it's basically all of their most played champions, and so it just puts them in this position where they can play so much more aggressive because they know what they can and cannot get away with. Game number 2 was just as good, though. It's not like the Azir ended up really faltering in that second game. Quad was so unbelievably good in the 1v1 and was able to generate such a gigantic lead against Palafox that he was so far ahead in resources. He was doing so much damage in the mid game, and it really was difficult for Shopify to be able to fight over a lot of the key objectives. We'll talk about that when we get to the Shopify section, but their macro was not particularly particularly good, and FlyQuest's macro was unbelievably good. Like, they were just everywhere on the map. They had a very, very good understanding of how to control a lot of the new objectives, how to play around a lot of the new systems, specifically Otacon, which Shopify really struggled with. And, FlyQuest, I think, just did a great job, and Quad was definitely kind of the driving force in that regard, but I do not want to say that, like, Masu and Busio shouldn't get a major shout out here. Masu was excellent on both the Ashe and the Jhin. I really like him on these, I don't want to say like utility AD carries, but generally speaking, Ashe and Jhin are considered the utility AD carries, and Masu, I think, fits that role really well on this team in particular because you do have so many aggressive players elsewhere. Quad does want a lot of resources. Inspired, of course, does want a lot of resources, even if he didn't get them in this series. And Bwipo, maybe he doesn't want resources in the early game, but he certainly does want to be a little bit more aggressive. I think having setup coming out of the bot lane, alongside Busio, I think is always a positive for FlyQuest. Again, this is something they've shown a lot over the past couple of years, and I thought Masu's mechanics were unbelievable here. He continues to take that leap forward. If he's going to play like he did at Worlds and not so much like he did in spring of last year across this entire domestic split, he's going to be first team All-Pro. He was unbelievably good when the lights were the brightest, and it felt like he had but he had leveled up, right? By the end of his rookie year, he had kind of grown into the player we all kind of wanted him to be. Busio was excellent here. Inspired goes Deathless on Ivern and Sejuani. Not the easiest job in the world. Contracts was not very good at all in this series, and we'll talk about that on the other side, but Inspired just completely out-jungled him in basically every aspect. Bwipo. He was super aggressive, sometimes getting himself into trouble that he didn't need to get into. Teams, generally speaking, are just going to put more resources into Bwipo. His death numbers are always going to be rather inflated because he is known for, absorbing pressure and dying on the top side and, allowing the rest of his team to do all those things. He is very exploitable in that way, but he was still valuable. Definitely the better of these two top laners, just maybe not quite as clean as the rest of this team. But again, I can't reiterate this enough. The macro of FlyQuest was phenomenal. It feels like they have actually done a really good job of adapting to this new map and this new meta. It feels like they're very comfortable with a lot of the new systems, or maybe Shopify is just not comfortable. I don't really know just yet, but FlyQuest looked really good in that regard. And, Quad dominating 1v1 and getting such a gigantic lead to be able to play off of, it just makes things so much easier for FlyQuest. And then for Shopify on the other side, they kind of just got outplayed everywhere. I would say the only player who didn't feel completely outmatched in their individual role was Bvoy, but even then, it's not like he was really doing all that much in these games. On Varus, on Caitlyn, he wasn't going to be able to take over these moments. The top side of the map was just too much of a hindrance, and he didn't really have any teammates that were actually in positions to be able to follow up or create at any point, really. There was no avenue for them to be able to win some of these fights outside of FlyQuest, just kind of giving them free objectives for towers. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Fudge. He was not good. There's really no other way to say this. He was really bad on the top side, just kind of got exploited. Bwipo was super aggressive in this series, and Fudge never really was able to answer. There were so many times where these two were fighting off in side lanes, and Fudge just forgot that Inspired could be nearby, or didn't really realize that Bwipo would only really fight Fudge if he was in a position where he could, win back, and, maybe Inspired was there if he was taking these weird random trades. It felt like Fudge was just kind of, AFK mentally in this one. I think he's going to be just fine. This wasn't the most concerning performance in the world, and again, losing to FlyQuest isn't awful, but those are some concerning tendencies. I'm arguably more concerned with Contracts, who just looked completely out of his depth here. I think Fudge individually played worse, and I think you can point to more moments where Fudge messed up, but the base mechanics of Contracts in this series were absolutely horrendous. The Skarner and the Vi, he just was outclassed in every way by Inspired. He was out-tempoed in the early game. He was never able to fight over objectives in the mid game, and he didn't know what he was doing at all in the late game. This was just an awful performance from Contracts. I think if you wanted to give him dud of the series, that's entirely fair. Palafox got brutally beaten in the mid lane 1v1. Like I said, Quad got gigantic leads on his own. It wasn't even really just intervention from the rest of the team. Typically speaking, Quad does like to receive a lot of resources early from his jungler. That's really where Inspired liked to go a lot last year, but he didn't need it this one. Palafox was just kind of giving him a lot of free advantages. He wasn't miserable, he wasn't running it down, and he was okay in late game team fights, but Palafox once again kind of showing that downward trajectory of his laning phase last year, it is going to continue. Zeyzal was not particularly good here, certainly didn't feel like a player that is fighting for his spot in the LTA. This was not a great performance, and you're hoping you can get Seos in here as quickly as possible. And again, Bvoy was, I guess, generally fine, but it's not like he did anything exceptional. He just didn't lose quite as hard as everybody else. I think there are concerning moments here for Shopify, but again, I don't want to make judgment assertions on a team that lost to FlyQuest, who is and should be the best team in the league. Fly looks incredible. Shopify's macro is really not good. Their Otacon setups in particular are pretty awful, and FlyQuest was able to take advantage of that. Shopify should be able to clean those things up, especially against worse teams, but for now, FlyQuest very much cementing themselves as the rightful number one team in the power rankings. Then moving on to our second series here, and yet another one with, I think, a predictable outcome, but this one was much closer in terms of execution. It was Lyon Gaming taking on Cloud9, and Cloud9 is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 win. They don't drop a single game here, but like I said, this was actually a pretty close series. There were some good performances on Lyon. They just didn't really have the full package. We'll just say one of their players wasn't even here. He's not able to get his visa, and he wasn't able to get in time, and because they didn't have a sub, they needed some sort of emergency option. Lions ends up playing remotely, and that's a pretty funny thing to end up happening, but the rest of this team just felt pretty discoordinated. It very much felt like the Latin American players were not on the same page as everybody else on this team, which I will get into. Not that they were inherently just awful or significantly worse mechanically, although you could certainly make the argument in some cases, just that it really did not feel like they were making the same decisions as the rest of the team. For Cloud9, they just did a great job of being able to flex their individual skill and being able to get individual leads. This team was indeed just better in this one. I think a lot of people forget, like, yes, Cloud9 kind of underperformed at the end of last year in the playoffs. They were, supposed to be a team that was going to Worlds, and, they were supposed to be the #1 team in the league at the beginning of the year, and all of that stuff, but they didn't lose, they only lost a single best of 3 in the regular season. They beat FlyQuest in the regular season in a best of 3. This was not a team that was, like, super disappointing for all of summer split. They got upset in the playoffs for sure. They were really good in the regular season. They were going into the playoffs as the #2 seed in the league. They only lost to the undefeated Team Liquid, and so I think a lot of people were expecting this team to, like, be 4th best because they were 4th best last year. I just don't think that that's going to happen. I think this team was better than 100 Thieves last year, and I think, unfortunately for them, they just lost this one series that mattered the most, and hopefully they'll be able to make up for it. But this looked like the version of Cloud9 you wanted to see. They didn't necessarily dominate the same way FlyQuest did, where it was just this gigantic macro difference in the mid to late game. This was like an individual's difference throughout most of this game. Not only did Lions, like, main, core players really struggle. ODLAN was really bad in this series, and we will get to that, but oh my god, like, the Cloud9 dominance mechanically was very, very clear. Thanatos is a very clear player of the series. I have not seen top lane dominance like this in a while. I mean, he was up 50, 60 CS, like, super regularly throughout this entire series, and I get these matchups are good and, generally are strong for him, but one of the things that we praised him for coming into not only this year, but, when he got signed by Cloud9, even though I was a little bit lower on what his current ability was, one of the things that there was never going to be a question about is that he was going to dominate lane. It was all really a question of, is he going to be able to carry that dominance into the late game, and that still hasn't really been solidified. I do want to say it got a ton better at the end of last year, but this guy's laning stats are just going to be unbelievable. He's going to be the best laner in the entire league, maybe outside of Lyon, like, in the bot lane. This guy is just absolutely absurd in the 1v1, and really, he punished Licorice quite a bit. ODLAN did give him quite a few free resources throughout parts of this game, but he was a big reason why he had his gigantic lead. Like, his mechanics are just better than everybody else's, and that's becoming very clear. You also want to give a big shout out to Loki. I was very, very much not sure what we were going to see out of Loki coming in here to the mid lane. I know it's just Series 1, and Saint was fine here. I'm certainly not going to try and talk down to Saint. He was one of the better players over on Lyon on the other side of this, but Loki coming in and, playing against the other Challengers League, player that was brought over this past offseason, and you know what? He looked really good, especially in the late game. If Thanatos was the one dominating the laning phase, Loki was the one cleaning up a lot of these fights on things like Aurora and Yone. So really nice to see the solo laners in particular, the 2 imports, doing well for Cloud9. Blabber was much better than ODLAN on the other side of this. Didn't really have to do all that much in terms of being super proactive, just had to make sure that he could facilitate his solo laners being in good spots. Sven and Vulcan looked like their old selves, like they've had synergy before. They've looked very good as a duo in the past, and I think that carried over here to this first series. Just generally a lot of good things for Cloud9. Again, maybe you want to see them clean up some things, but I don't think it was them playing bad as much as it was a couple of players on Lyon playing well and kind of keeping them in these games, and Cloud9 just being generally better across the board, which is what allows them to be able to close these out. Really impressed specifically with Thanatos, but with Loki as well. And, as for Lyon, I've kind of already talked about a lot of it, but ODLAN is dud of the series. Like, there's just no other way to say this. He ran it. Like, he had a miserable series. This is not a very good debut for him in terms of playing in North America. The Nocturne wasn't very good in game number 1, but the Vi was arguably even more puzzling in game number 2, just ulting people under tower and instantly dying and being in the wrong place at the wrong time, being way too overeager. Like I said, it just felt like he was completely disconnected from a macro perspective from everybody else on Lyon, and that's just not good enough, right? There's no way to win games against teams like Cloud9 that are very good if you're going to play like that, really was not impressed with him. He was somebody that I was hoping was going to be like a mid to maybe even slightly below average like jungler, like someone who could keep up with the other junglers but wasn't going to be particularly impressive. Very similar to what we saw out of Jose Deodo when he was jungling in the league, where he would have some pop-off moments, but generally speaking was just slightly average to slightly below average. Odieland did not start off that tenure in that range. This was a miserable series. I think you can also point to Lyons not being particularly proactive here, but I'm going to cut him some slack because he was playing remote, and I imagine it's just a different vibe. Licorice also got completely outplayed in the top lane matchup. He was much better in the second half, and a lot of that was Odieland's fault in terms of him losing lane as hard as he did, but still worth noting that Licorice was not as good as Thanatos, and that's not a good sign for Lyon because they need Licorice to be good. I think the big positive for them is that their imports were actually really good as well. Saint and Henna, I think both showed a lot of really good things in this series. Saint was on a lot of comfort picks. The Ahri in particular was definitely one of the champions that we knew him most for in the Challengers League, and I think that very much came through. Even if he wasn't quite as good as Loki on the other side of this, he definitely tried, and Henna was honestly perfectly fine. Henna is a perfectly serviceable AD carry. I've never been impressed by his mechanical upside, and we'll see if that ends up being wrong, like if North America really is just that far behind in terms of mechanics, but it looked good in Series 1. Like, Sven was still fine. It's not like he, gave over free resources, but Henna was arguably the better bot laner between these two just in terms of individual showcasing. I think he had a lot more resources and certainly was somebody that was in a better position to be the primary option, where Sven was playing Ashe and Ziggs and wasn't necessarily asked to be the primary option in a lot of these games, but Saint and Henna looking good is necessary for Lyon to even be remotely, competitive, at all. Like, a team that's even going to be near number 6 in terms of these rankings, because jungle looks like it's bottom 1, support could very much be bottom 1. I think that that's decently realistic, and if Saint and Henna are going to be good, but maybe not quite as good as the upper echelon players in their roles, like, if Saint's not going to be better than Loki in terms of production, or if Henna's not going to be better than, Sven or FBI or players like that in terms of production that are kind of in that middle tier, then I think Lyon is going to struggle. That's the reason I had them at number 8. It's not because I don't think there's talent and upside here, just that I think the complete package is very much not there. I think I am concerned about what happens when this team doesn't get a lead in the early game. And for Cloud9, they're just so good at getting leads in the early game. I'm kind of scared for them in the same way where they're not a particularly good macro team, or they weren't last year. They're not great at playing from behind, but they are so talented mechanically that they are able to get these big leads, and I would expect that to be able to continue against most of the league this year. Then moving on to day number 2 and our third series of round number 1, week number 1, whatever you want to call it here. It was 100 Thieves taking on Disguised in DSG's debut and the guest spot's debut here in the LTA North. And unfortunately for the guest spot, it didn't look particularly good in series number 1. 100 Thieves absolutely obliterated them. Once again, it's just the team that feels a lot more comfortable with the new map that ends up coming out on top and just looking like they are able to dominate a lot of these matchups. I think 100 Thieves definitely had some mechanical superiority in the same way that we've talked about with these other teams, where they are just kind of better than the team that they're going into, but they definitely had a much better game plan going into this than DSG did. I hate their draft in game number 2. I think it's actually unplayable at certain times, and I'm not hearing that talked about as much as you would normally expect to hear about it, considering how much people like to blame draft, and 100 Thieves very much took advantage of that. I think they played well. I'm certainly not trying to, take anything away from them, but it once again just feels like a check of who is more comfortable playing around Otacon and who is more comfortable playing around that position. We'll talk about why it very much felt like 100 Thieves had a great idea of what they wanted to do in this one as we go along. Player of the series is very obviously going to go to FBI. Spoiler alert for dud of the series, this was a huge AD carry gap, at least in terms of production. I'm going to talk about it for game number 2. I'm not even entirely blaming it on Scary Jerry. That Jinx game is impossible to play out, but he did nothing. There was nothing happening on the other side of this. He played incredibly poor, and FBI took advantage of that. He was so active on the map. He was creating so much for this team. We knew this was going to be an upgrade. I actually did see a lot of people online talking about how FBI was better than Tomo and how, 100 Thieves fans were actually kind of excited to bring him on. I was really surprised by that, considering the general reputation that FBI has had. I've received personally a ton of pushback over the course of the last few years, putting him highly in my rankings. It's nice to see that it does feel like people aren't blaming him too much for what happened on NRG last year, and this is a clear example as to why. When you put him in a good situation where he is able to just kind of dominate early and scale that into the mid game, he can still break games open at the LTA level. He is really, really good for North American AD carries. He is right up there with a lot of the other top ones, like with Sven. I think he's a very similarly graded player in my eyes, and he had a very similar performance. Both the Varus and the Misfortune I thought were really excellent. Even if this was more of a team effort, FBI still was the one that I think was not only gaining the most resources, but doing the most with with them. I think Quid and Ayla are the two other players that I really want to point out in a positive way. Quid was definitely just the better of these two mid laners. Abbedagga played fine mechanically speaking, but made a lot of weird mental decisions that I think held DSG back, and Quid was very much there to take advantage of that. I still believe Quid is the best mid laner in North America at the current moment, and nothing here kind of changes my mind on that or dissuades me from that feeling. Ayla was really good in this series. Again, another player that I think gets a really bad reputation just because he's maybe not like top 3 caliber. He is not a top 3 caliber support, or at least I wouldn't anticipate him to be a top 3 caliber support, but his good games now just don't get talked about. He had a lot of really good games last year, especially when this team needed them the most. He was great against Cloud9 in the playoffs. He was a big reason why they ended up getting to Worlds, and so to see him have good chemistry with FBI, obviously two country mates coming from Australia, coming from OS, really good to see them, look as good as they did in their debut series, even if the bot lane on the other side was probably the weak point for DSG. River was fine, certainly not criticizing him, but this was a very River-esque series where he didn't really do as much as you would think he would do in the early game, and then eventually just kind of was there for Quid and FBI to take over in terms of damage. Sniper was fine, Castle was better on the other side of this matchup, which isn't surprising. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of Sniper and what he was in 2024, but Castle was excellent, and we'll get to that. Sniper was fine. I'm not criticizing Sniper too much. It's not like it was his fault that Castle got super fed, but Quid and FBI definitely the standouts, and Ayla I thought was really excellent here. The bot lane looks phenomenal for 100 Thieves, and they needed to in their debut. And then for Disguised on the other side, there's no other way to say it. Scary Jerry is dud of the series. I really don't like saying that because I am a big fan of Scary Jerry, and I wanted to see him come out and look really good in the first series. But one thing I want to remind people of, as somebody who covers the NACL, Scary Jerry didn't look dominant in his first split in Tier 2 either. It's not like he was really great in 2023. He was fine. Like, Maryville in general was just fine. They didn't really adapt super quickly to being able to play at that Tier 2 level. It took that next offseason and, for players like UG and Spyrax to come in and really kind of raise the floor of that team for Jerry to, grow into that. And that was kind of the case in Tier 3 as well. I think the thing that was most encouraging about Jerry is how consistently he has been getting better and how he is somebody that just is on that upward trajectory, but he could struggle quite a bit at first, and we saw that here. Again, I'm not blaming it entirely on him. This Jinx game feels very difficult to play out if you are the AD carry, but at the end of the day, he was the one making the most mistakes, and he was the biggest problem in game number 2. They were kind of drafting around him, and he just couldn't really do anything. He wasn't really helping. I don't think he had a particularly good series. Ayla completely outplayed him. Like I said, Abbedagga's mechanics were fine, but his mental was just weird. Like, he made a lot of weird movement decisions throughout this series. I just wasn't a big fan of how he ended up playing this, and then XU was whatever, right? Like, completely a non-factor, we'll just say. He was somebody that I barely noticed, quite frankly, throughout both of these games. Just wasn't really somebody to pay note to. He was not particularly great, just felt like a lower tier jungler, which I think is the concern here. But if you want a positive for Disguise, Castle looked excellent. And this is also not shocking. Like, Immortals was nothing last year. This team is always a disaster. Immortals is always a disaster, and every player they bring in looks worse on that organization than they do basically anywhere else. And Castle might have just been a byproduct of that. He was winning games for that team last year. It just wasn't really consistent in any way, and it was clear that it was easy for him to mentally check out. But I was okay with his tape coming out of the Challengers League. Didn't love it, but didn't hate it either. And there was a lot of flashes last year where you could see the mechanical ceiling. He looked great in this series. Maybe a little bit over-aggressive, but like he needed to be. He was the only player on Disguised that was attempting to actually win them these games, and I think he did fine. Like, I'm certainly not going to criticize him. He is the one player on this team that I think is not deserving of judgment. I would very much take this performance from Castle any day of the week. It was just everybody else that kind of felt outclassed. Again, Abbedagga felt like he could go toe-to-toe, but XU, Jerry, Huhi, they just didn't feel all that great for Disguised in this performance. Again, we're seeing imports really carry the way for a lot of these teams, and these North American players, and especially these promotions from the NACL, they kind of have to be better, especially for DSG, if they're going to be as good as I rank them in my power rankings. But nice win for 100 Thieves. Their bot lane looks great. Quid, I think, is going to be fine. Quid and River have really good chemistry, and, Sniper, I don't think he's a superstar, but he should be good enough on the top side for you to be able to win, just like he was last year. 100 Thieves is a scary team. They're in the top 4 for a reason, and I think they solidified that here. And then moving on to our fourth and final series of the week. It's always a pretty quick video here in the LTA with only 4 series to cover. Again, no real upsets to talk about here. It's Team Liquid taking on Dignitas, and Team Liquid is going to pick up the 2-0 win. That's 4 straight 2-0s to start round number 1. Not that any of them are particularly surprising. It always very much felt like a top 4. Very, very bare minimum. You could maybe say top 5 if you wanted to put Shopify in terms of your projections in there, but not against FlyQuest. They weren't going to be a top top 4 team. You know, that's just the way that the cookie crumbles. It's the way the dice ended up rolling, and everything kind of went according to plan this week. Team Liquid, again, looking as good as they could possibly look. It feels like they are a team that should be able to adapt to this new map pretty well. They are pretty aggressive in the early game. They do really like to play for certain laning phases, especially bot lane and top lane. They like to get those two ahead, and then they like to play for late game outs with players like APA. And so, you know, I really like the way that they end up, constructing for this current meta. And Dignitas, boy, did they not have a good time in this first series. Once again, it feels like top lane is entirely elo held. Very funny that day 2 consisted of 2 not so great teams losing, even though their top laners played incredibly well. And just kind of is the way that it is. Dig, the other team with a major substitution that we will obviously talk about. But for Team Liquid, player of the series for me is going to go to Core JJ in the support position. I don't want to say that I was low on Core JJ because that feels wrong. Like, that doesn't feel accurate towards my opinion on him. He is still very much in the upper echelon. Like, I had him with the same grade as, both Vulcan and Busio. It felt like they were the top 3 and you could kind of move them around in whatever way you wanted. I just had him at the bottom of that because I didn't think he was quite as dominant as those two last year, and it seems like everybody else kind of had the opposite opinion. Going back and watching the tape specifically in the bot lane, it felt like Lyon was doing so much of the work, and Core was more so along for the ride in the 2v2. Now, Core obviously adds a ton of intangibles that aren't on tape, and that's what keeps him in that upper echelon forever, is because he is probably the one that helps Lyon most mentally in terms of being able to play out the game and unlocking his mechanics. But no, this was a mechanical series from Core JJ. He did show that he could still dominate in terms of his ability to control the map in the mid game. The Renata was excellent in game 1. That's the game that I think is going to go a bit under the radar. The Pantheon game was more obviously fun from him because he does solo kill Surdy on the top side of the map as Pantheon into Aurora, which is just hilarious. But the Renata game was still very excellent, and the setup he was able to give there was really important. So Core to me is going to get player of the series. I think it's pretty open for debate. Jan was excellent here on both the Draven and the Corki, but like I said, I think a lot of it was the setup of Core. Not that Jan didn't do a good job capitalizing on it. They were by far the better bot lane of these two. And then APA is the other very obvious answer because of just the sheer damage output he was doing in the back half of these games on both Azir and Talia. Like, the bottom side of this map was terrific. Impact was awesome. Even if Surdy was getting super far ahead, Impact was doing the Impact thing of staying relatively neutral in laning phase, not really allowing himself to fall super far behind, and then being super crucial towards their ability to win team fights in the back half of the game. This was your 2020, 2019 version of Impact kind of returning here, and that's a good sign. He didn't need to win lane in order to feel relevant in the back half of the game, even if his lane opponent was doing really well. is still the one player that I don't think is, like, dominating in the same kind of way. His opposition in this series was completely non-existent, and honestly, I think he could have pushed it a lot harder. I'm still not blown away by I think he's a good player and not a great player, surrounded by a bunch of great players, and there was nothing in this series to end up changing my mind on that. But APA, Jan, Core, even Impact to a lesser extent, I think played phenomenal. And, this was Team Liquid. This was a Team Liquid-esque performance, and them showing exactly what I think a lot of people wanted to see. And then for Dig on the other side, Surdy was awesome, and if you wanted a good debut for what I presume Dig sees as their new franchise player, this was it, because he really was super active on the map. I would argue this was an even better series than what Castle just had against 100 Thieves, even though he was on the losing side, and even though he did get solo killed by the support in game number 2. But there was, again, nothing on this team outside of top lane. Everybody else just got completely obliterated. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Lyra in the jungle. Obviously, he's a substitute, and I don't know how much time they had scrimming with him. He was a coach that was brought on to coach in the offseason for Dig, and ended up having to start for this team because, Shaden didn't have his visa ready for all of the offseason behavioral, investigations that he was going through. Shaden reportedly will be back for round number, 1, lower bracket round number 1 or round number 2 or whatever you want to call it. This was the only series I believe that Lyra will be playing in the LTA, and thank God for that for Dig, because he did nothing. Like, he just looked super passive. He looked super scared. His mechanics looked super rusty. He was not a tier 1 player in this series. There's really no way to identify that. It's not like the rest of this team ended up playing well, but like I said, was given basically free reign of the entire jungle throughout all of this series, and that was mostly because Lyra just didn't look like he was even remotely in the vicinity of being able to play these games. This is not the Lyra that we saw on Clutch Gaming or on, previous teams in the past. This is, we're long past the version of Lyra in North America that can be like a near upper half jungler. He was not good at all. Again, just the scoreline doesn't even really do it justice because he wasn't doing anything throughout this series. The rest of the team was also bad. Tomo and Isles got completely outplayed. There were some people, me included, that were optimistic that this bot lane could be fine, because the last time these two played together, I actually really liked the way that they played in spring of last year. It felt like they had very good synergy as a duo, and obviously that's kind of what you wanted to build on. But if there was one lane in spring last year that was better than them and that did kind of have their number, it was Yon and Core JJ. Not really a great matchup for them to start off their tenure because of their history not playing particularly well against Team Liquid, but Tomo and Isles were not good at all, even if I don't think they were the biggest problems. Kana was miserable. Like, he did not look even remotely on the same level as APA. I think reasonably, if you wanted to give dud of the series to someone that wasn't Lyra, like someone who actually is going to be playing for Dignitas, Kana is the one to give it to, because he just did absolutely nothing throughout this series, and again, just his mechanics were not there. I'm optimistic that maybe things will look better against worse mid laners. APA is one of the better mid laners in North America at the current moment, but man, things just did not look good for Dignitas outside of Surdy. It very much reminds me of Surdy's time in 2023 in the NACL when he was on teams like Team Liquid First for a lot of his tenure, where the rest of that team just wasn't good enough to be able to compete in Tier 2, and he was having to do all of the heavy lifting. It feels like it's going to be a very similar circumstance here for him on Dignitas. Again, maybe things change. I think Tomo and Isles theoretically should do better against bot lanes that aren't Yon and Core JJ, like the best laning bot lane in the entire league, because that is their strength, is the 2v2, and it didn't work out. And maybe getting Shaden back here, just getting a jungler that is a little bit more practiced in terms of, being able to play at a top level right now, is going to make them better. But Dig looked awful here, like the worst team in the league. This was the worst team in the league type of performance, and it just looked pretty miserable. But Team Liquid looks great. I mean, Yon and Core look excellent. APA looks excellent. Impact is Impact, and, Umpty is Umpty. We know what this team is. They didn't look any different than what I expected them to look in this first series, or really what they looked like down the stretch of last year, and hopefully that's going to be the case. Again, all of the top teams kind of performing in week number 1. All right, but that is going to do it for my LTA North round number 1 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated bracket after round number 1. We can see that we are coming up on some qualification matches going into round number 2. Of course, Team Liquid taking on 100 Thieves, FlyQuest taking on Cloud9. The winner of those two best of 3s will be going to playoffs, quote unquote. I think it's called the cross conference or something like that. The top 4 teams from LTA North and LTA South will be playing off against each other for a chance to go to first stand, and we're going to know our first 2 representatives after next week. Of course, there also is the lower bracket, Dig taking on Disguised and Shopify Rebellion taking on Lyon Gaming. There still is a lot to play for all of these teams. Top 4 is guaranteed to go in, and it is double elimination. Anybody can still make it through. Nobody is eliminated after one best of 3, but we definitely got pretty big confirmation that a couple of these teams are going to be pretty heavy favorites going in. The top 4 feel like the top 4, bottom 4 feel like the bottom 4, and I would imagine things end up going that way unless something, crazy happens with Shopify actually being good and FlyQuest really just being that dominant at the top of the standings. I'm going to stick to my power rankings. No changes this week at all. I know we could theoretically, move some teams up and down in the bottom of the standings. I don't think Lyon looked like the worst team in week number 1. I think Disguise looked worse than them. I think Dig looked worse than them. You could theoretically have Lyon move up to number 6 if you really wanted to do that, but there's no reason to make changes when every single result went exactly as expected and went exactly as the power rankings would indicate. Next week is going to be a lot more telling, I think, in terms of where we want to move these teams and where we think they are going to land going into a lot of the future splits. And so for now, that's just how I'm going to do it. No changes, and, we'll see how it goes. Again, predictions, I guess, for next week. If we're talking about the 4 series we have on screen, I think Team Liquid will beat 100 Thieves. I think FlyQuest will beat Cloud9. I think those are, potential upset alerts, like FlyQuest and Cloud9. I guess theoretically could be a close series if C9 actually is really good, which I think is possible. They are, a team that I think could be in the upper echelon, but FlyQuest are favorites. If they were playing Team Liquid, I think this would be a little bit more interesting for me, just because I think Blabber could out jungle Umpty, but Fly and TL should have this. And then on the lower side of the bracket, Dig versus DSG is going to be very, very telling. If Shaden is back in, that's a huge boon to Dignitas, and, the top lane matchup here is going to be interesting after what happened in round 1. Surdy versus Castle, I think, is a very intriguing matchup, but I am going to stick to my guns here, and I am going to say that I think Disguised will be better because I thought they were going to be better in the offseason, and honestly, both teams looked miserable this week. They both looked very similar, and I'm going to stick to my offseason grades if that is going to be the difference maker. You have Shopify Rebellion taking on Lyon Gaming. This should be Shopify. Like, they should be a team that is better than Lyon Gaming, but I don't know. Saint and Henna looked pretty solid this week. They certainly looked better than Shopify did, even if they were playing a team that maybe wasn't quite as dominant, and so we'll see what ends up happening there, but I'm taking Disguised and Shopify as the winners on the lower side, and Team Liquid and FlyQuest as the winners on the top side. Let me know if you agree or disagree with those takes down in the comment section below, but let's go ahead and move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week for round number 1. Player of the week to me is going to go to Quad, the mid laner for FlyQuest. It felt like he was the most dominant across both games of his series. Not that there weren't other great options, as you can see in the runner-ups, but Quad really was the one that I think stood out the most to me in terms of just his ability to dominate 1v1 against Palafox in both of Game 1 and Game 2, and still take over in the later half of the game. I think you can look at certain sections for both of the runner-ups that, you could consider, but to me, Quad was the obvious choice. And then Thanatos and FBI are going to be considered my honorable mentions here. Thanatos because he was dominant in lane, but not quite as dominant in the team fight stage. Similar thing for FBI, although I do think his game was very well-rounded, but I think 100 Thieves in general was just really strong this week. Again, you could put someone like Core JJ on this list as well. I just didn't think he had quite as well-rounded of a week as Thanatos or FBI, and, Quad was that obvious choice for player of the week. And then dud of the week was also really obvious for me. It's going to go to Odilan. I did not have to think about this. He was the worst player in the LTA in week number 1, and it was not particularly close. This is even including players like Lyra and Zazel that were not supposed to be starting for their individual teams. Odilan just felt completely outclassed by Cloud9, by Blabber, by everybody, by, the communication barrier that he had on his own individual team. It just looked awful. Hopefully things can get better moving into round 2 or moving into lower bracket round 1, but if he's going to play like he did against Cloud9 against Shopify, they're not going to win that series. Like, it's going to be impossible for them to be able to take over. Contracts is going to have a field day against a player like that, and so dud of the week for me is going to go to Odilan, and player of the week is going to go to Quad, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Of course, we're not just covering the LTA North on this channel. We cover all 3 of the other major regions, so LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week that they have games. The schedules are all out of whack in terms of these regions. We're already getting really close to winter playoffs and obviously to first stand, and so all these games already matter a ton, and if you want to know my thoughts and analysis on all of these teams as they head into some of these international tournaments, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all